Okay, so the session is being recorded. So for those who haven't been able to join, welcome when you watch this video. Thank you. I assume you are all now in the swing of this process and that you've had a little bit of time to go through this first chapter of your textbook. And I'm also assuming you all have the correct textbook as given in your module outline. So please make sure you're using the right textbook, which is Wayne Wheaton, Psychology Themes and Variations, which is our textbook as indicated in your module outline. So this is our first learning unit on the evolution of psychology. So at any point, if you've got a question during this collab, please just pop it in the chat and I will try to respond to it straight away. Otherwise, just put your hand up or give me a shout. And if you don't have any questions now, but you have a question later on, you are welcome to send me an email or pop me a message and I will answer you straight away. So there's not too many of you tonight. I think this group in total is about 20 students. So I see I've got about a quarter of you, but that's also fine. But I thank you for taking the time. So you're all with me and we can get going. So our very first chapter, our very first learning unit is on the evolution of psychology. So that is how psychology as a science and a discipline has developed over time. So I'll make reference to the module outline, and if you have the module outline to work from, the module is broken into different themes. So the first theme 1 being what is psychology, the second theme being the history of psychology, and the third theme being the perspectives of psychology. So that's what we will cover tonight. I'll cover the important points, and anything I don't cover and you're not sure of, you're welcome to let me know. So that's what we're doing. We're following chapter 1 of your textbook, and the specific references on the right-hand side where it refers to certain tables. So please make use of those in your textbook because they're quite important that you understand them. So it doesn't refer to everything, but it does point you in certain directions for the more important information. So it's chapter 1 and we're off. So welcome to psychology. The first thing that we need to understand is we sort of need to understand what psychology is and what it is as a discipline. So psychology comes from sort of 2 basic areas. One is from philosophy, and the ability to ask philosophical, meaningful questions. But that's coupled with scientific reasoning. It's really important to understand at this point that psychology is a science. And we'll see that as we go through, and I will explain that in more detail. So psychology is not subjective. It's not our own personal opinions. It's based on sound scientific questioning and reasoning and answering the questions we have scientifically to provide evidence for what we are proposing. So the discipline of psychology comes from philosophy and asking those hard questions or questioning questions, coupled with scientific reasoning. So it comes from, the word psychology comes from 2 Greek words, the first one meaning psyche, which is the soul, and logos, meaning the study of something. And in this case, psychology basically is the study of 3 things. It's a study of our minds, it's a study of mental processes, our thinking, and it's the study of behavior. So those 3 things. A lot of books say that it's the study of mind and behavior, but this introduces mental processes. So it has 3 key components to it. The psychology is the study of mind, thinking or cognitive processes, as well as our behavior. And psychology has been around for thousands of years, and it is ever evolving. It's not static. It changes all the time with new research, new theories, new evidence. And as time has gone on, it has progressed more rapidly. And as society has changed, psychology as a discipline has also changed to adapt to what is happening in our societies and our culture around us. So what you need to be able to do is you need to be able to define what psychology is. And when a question asks you to define what psychology is, don't just provide the definition from the textbook. So I don't want to see that when people say what is psychology, that someone says it comes from 2 Greek words meaning this and meaning that. Put in some research and come to a clear understanding of what you understand psychology to be from the research that you do. But basically, it's ever evolving and it is a scientific discipline. So there we have it. Psychology is a scientific study of the mind, mental processes, and behavior. Therefore, it is a science. It's science because it follows what they call the empirical method. That's about doing experiments or doing research, analyzing results, a very scientific process, the same way you would see in a laboratory when people are working with discovering a new cure for something. It's done through a very clear stepwise scientific process. And that is because of the way it does it. It investigates. Okay, so its empiricism emphasizes the fact that it's very objective. It's not subjective. It's not our own thoughts and it's our feelings. It's objective and it looks at measuring things. And we'll see that in our next learning unit where we look at the basis of research and psychology around quantitative and qualitative research. That research is very important. And that is why when you study psychology and you go back and you want to add to topics, you look for research articles. You look at what science has been done to actually come up with a theory or to explain a theory or to explain a phenomenon. It's coming from research with measurements and very precise and very accurate. So psychology and other behavioral sciences, which we look at things like sociology, anthropology, economics, and political sciences, for example, are not as precise as biology and chemistry or physics, but psychologists use that empirical evidence in what they do. Therefore, it's scientific. So it sits in there with other scientific disciplines. It's got a scientific background to it. I hope that's clear, and it's really important to understand that. And we'll see as we go through how different experiments are done, how different research things are applied so that people can come up with theories that they're substantiated by evidence. So when we look at the scientific method, it's very systematic. It's a process where we identify, we analyze, and we describe things. Those are important words when it comes to looking at scientific study. It's about identifying, analyzing, and describing things. And in this case, in psychology, what we're identifying, analyzing, and describing are those key components. It's the mind and our cognitive or thinking that happens in our mind. It's those mental processes that take place. And more importantly, it's behavior. So science is that systematic approach of studying those key components of what make up psychology. Okay, any questions? I think that's straightforward. It's understanding it as a scientific discipline. And the more work we'll do, you'll see that why that is so. So the goal of psychology ultimately is to describe phenomena that are happening, psychological phenomena, to explain them and to be able to understand them, and then to use that information to be able to predict what could happen in the future around behavior or mental processes and to make changes or adjustments. So when we look at things like abnormal psychology, it's how can we change behaviors so that they are more appropriate or more socially acceptable. So the ultimate goal is to be able to predict how somebody could act, think, or behave, and to make modifications. That is our goal in psychology, ultimately, when we start to study it and get deeper into it. So when we look at those core components that we said psychology is made up of the study of the mind. So what is the mind? The mind is not the brain, but it originates in the brain, and it's the part of our being that fosters what is human consciousness. And it is our mind that produces those mental processes, and the processes can be unconscious. We might not know that they're happening. They happen unconsciously, or they can happen consciously. We have more control over them. So it's things like that produces those mental processes of what we think, of our memory, perception, learning, and reasoning. Those are the mental processes that are produced from the mind. And what happens in the mind is not really observable because we can't see the mind. We can't open up our brains and look at the mind. It's more observable in the things that come out of it, like our mental processes. So it's our mind that is able to put together different associations, attend to things in our experiences that are new and unique. And it's our mind that uses information that we know, and it also processes new knowledge. So it's situated in us, and it's a part of us. Our mind is what we're interested in and what emanates out of our mind, whether it's conscious things or whether it's things that come from our unconscious. And we'll see how that factors in a little bit later. The core component also is our mental processes. It is those activities of the brain that are required to produce a sequence of actions, changes, and functions. So it's very much our thoughts, our memories, our perceptions, our ability to learn. It's all of those mental processes that happen that have an outcome. Generally, when mental processes are applied to things, it's because something happens as an outcome of those mental processes, whether it's something we remember, something we think about, the way we perceive a situation, the way we learn. They're all geared towards an outcome. And at any point where there is a disruption or something wrong with how our mental processes are working, ultimately it is our behavior that is affected. So any disturbance in those mental processes is considered basically a disorder. It could be a learning disorder or a thinking disorder, but ultimately the outcome is that our behavior is affected. So the primary component then of psychology is behavior, and behavior is observable. That is where we see the outcome of all of these mental processes. It's in behavior, which is basically any response that's carried out by an organism. It's an outcome of a mental process. So it's very much dependent on those mental processes. Some of our behaviors are a response to things. If you have a fear of a spider and you see a spider, you could run away and be frightened. It's the response to something that's happening. It could be fear. What is our response to fear? We start to sweat and perspire, and our pupils dilate, and our heart beats faster, and we run away or we fight. Whatever it might be, it's a reaction to a stimulus. But we also have some behaviors that are a result of our body's functioning. And we look at things like the sleep cycle, which is a natural cycle that takes place, and sleeping and waking is a behavior, but it's not as a result necessarily of a stimulus, but it's a result of something in our body that happens as part of our functional system. It's part of our autonomic actions, like waking up in the morning. So those core components of psychology is the mind, the mental processes, and behavior. So you need to understand what those concepts are. That is pretty much what's out of your textbook, but at the same time, do additional research so that you guys can give a clear definition of what you understand those core components of psychology to be. And this first learning unit is really just going to touch on the surface of some of these things so that you get a clear idea of how they work and how they've been applied over the time psychology has developed and the different theorists. But ultimately, the outcome is going to be the study of the mind, the study of our mental processing, and our study of behavior. Those are our key components of psychology as a discipline. Okay, no questions. So basically, psychology is made up of basic tenets and propositions. A tenet is basically a belief or a principle that is applied, and a proposition is something that somebody has put forward. I propose something and it's been offered for consideration or acceptance based on what its outcome is. It's been studied and it's a proposition that's put forward by somebody. And a framework, which is the supporting structure that houses the discipline. So that's what psychology is supported by. It's supported by principles or beliefs that have been studied and put forward for consideration that all sit within a framework. And there's the big framework of psychology, but inside that framework are lots of sub-frameworks of different perspectives of psychology that really support these belief systems that have been studied. So psychology as a discipline, it goes back many, many, many years. And a lot of its framework comes from historical work. That means it's been done before. Now it's been done in the sort of 17, 18, 1900s. And that framework has remained, but it's been kept up to date because psychology as a discipline is ever evolving. Okay, so it's got historical roots to it, to some of its thinking, but at the same time, it is continually evolving. And you see that by the fact that its body of evidence is enormous now. Psychology as a discipline has been broken down into many, many, many sub-disciplines and sub-frameworks, and each one has got its own theorists and it's got its own researchers, it's got its own body of evidence, and together they all contribute to the discipline, but each one in its own way is relevant, based on the belief systems of what it proposes. So ultimately, psychology is historical but thoroughly progressive, and its ability to be fluid and to take into account where we are in time and what is happening around us from a social perspective, a cultural perspective, is what is keeping psychology evolving. And it also has a diversity of knowledge systems. So ultimately, as we said, it was influenced by a very early philosophy, that's its background. But as sort of science has grown, as research has grown, we've seen it become more influenced by natural science, by biological science, by cultural systems. So there's a diverse array of knowledge systems. And when we look at different theories and perspectives, each one takes different pieces of that and integrates it. So there is no one sort of primary definition of what sits inside that framework. There are multiple definitions depending on what part of psychology we're studying and whose beliefs and theories we're putting forward and whose beliefs and theories we tend to sort of inform us, rather some maybe more than others. Very much influenced by culture, very much influenced by the environment, very much influenced by different eras, very much influenced by the evolution of time, different frameworks and frames of reference. And based in that are different models that are based on different assumptions and values. And basically we call models paradigms, and a paradigm is something that is a widely accepted belief or principle. So that's really just showing you that from an evolutionary perspective, psychology is fluid in its development, and it encompasses a huge diverse array of knowledge systems. And you'll see that tonight as we just advance through the different perspectives. And we are just going to touch on them because we go into them in more detail in further learning units. So really, this is just to give you an idea of how psychology evolved and some of the important frames of reference or perspectives that we look at. Okay, so that is really psychology and how it sits as a discipline and a system of knowledge and information. And I'm not going to touch really too much on this very early birth, because what it says in your module outline is really just to be able to understand this. I think we really start to touch base more deeply around the 20th century. But what your textbook does is it really does guide you to the fact that psychology, not necessarily as a discipline, but as people examining various parts of it, like mental processes, for example, has been around for 27,000 years. There's a timeline in your book that covers various tables that really takes you back to ancient physicians who back 9,000 BCE, as before the Common Era, would drill into someone's skull to release demons, and various pieces of artifacts or evidence that says that sort of people started to look at thinking and disorders from way back across time, across cultures, and I won't dwell on it. It's in your textbook, and it's there for you to read. So just understand that the psychology as a discipline has come from many years ago. And that really just covers the work that in Greece is where Plato came into being, who described the brain as basically a seat of mental processes and the soul being served by the body. And then Aristotle came along and he basically said the mind starts as a completely blank slate, and everything we are is all of our experiences that have contributed to our being. And it goes on to Sigmund Freud, who will cover examples and types of madness. Many years ago, people started to talk about insanity and talk about disturbances of the mind and demons. So again, it's just indicating to you the history, the influence of Islam on psychology. Back in the 11th to 15th centuries, there was evidence of work around psychology and mental disorders and psychiatric disorders. And I'm not touching on this because you really just have to read through it in your textbook. It's a little bit like a history lesson. But really, when we get through to the 19th century, so remember the 19th century sits between the 1800s and 1899, and it was really now in the later part of the 19th century that psychology really came to the fore as a discipline in its own right. And that's sort of where we'll start the journey. And in the 1870s, William James was really the first person to introduce psychology as a discipline. Willem Wundt was the father of modern psychology. That's how he is described. And he's the person in Germany who established the first formal laboratory. It's starting to say to us that psychology is a scientific discipline. He established a laboratory so that he could test something. Okay, he developed the first journal in science, and his focus was basically on measuring people's reaction times. So he was researching at that point what he called the atoms of the mind, and he was looking at the speed of mental processes between when a stimulus happened and somebody could react to it. He was trying to measure that speed, the atoms of the mind. So he sort of considered the father of this modern psychology because he had his laboratory, and that's where psychology sort of started as that scientific discipline. So remember that to look at the centuries, because at one point it does sort of say to you around psychologists from the 20th century. So remember, he falls back into the 19th century. He's not part of the 20th century, but he's in here because he is the founder of what could be called modern psychology. So once psychology came to be in its sort of more modern format as a discipline, and it sometimes does sound a little bit like a history lesson, but it's in here because it's important to understand that not everybody thinks in the same way, that somebody could come along with, this is how I think about it, and then somebody can come along and say, well, no, I disagree with you, I think about it like this. So we call those schools of thought. And the first two major schools of thought, and remember this is still sitting in the 19th century, so it's pre-20th century, is the school of thought of what was called structuralism, compared to the school of thought which came after that called functionalism. And this is it's sort of, these schools of thought have fallen away now in modern psychology, but it really is just showing you how that scientific approach happened. So the structuralists, if you think structure, structuralism, they wanted to break the mind, which remember is something that is not observable. They wanted to try and break that down into very small elements. So all those little elements that put together to form a structure that is the mind, and that's what they were trying to examine. So the person who led that sort of school of thought was Edward Titchener, and he studied under Wilhelm Wundt, and he wanted to break consciousness down into basic elements. And how do people do that? Because remember, it's not observable. And so this is a concept that you'll see later on, is to use the method of introspection. And introspection means that you look inside yourself. You ask people questions, or you look inside yourself to get beyond what's conscious, to try and get into the unconscious. And so he wanted to examine consciousness and break it into basic elements. So he looked at experiences of auditory tones, he looked at visual stimuli, optical illusions, to try and get to the bottom of what is the mind and analyzing consciousness. So trying to break the mind down into smaller parts and different pieces. So then the structuralism sort of was overtaken by functionalism. And so that now doesn't necessarily deal with breaking things down into little pieces. It deals with the function. What is the function of behavior? And so that's where William James comes in. And he said that behavior is purposeful and behavior contributes to survival. So he wanted to investigate what the function and purpose of consciousness is, rather than looking at all the little elements of it. And he came to the thought that consciousness basically is a continuous flow of thoughts. And when you think about it, it's what it is. Consciousness it's a stream of consciousness. That we're always thinking, we're always acting. It's not static, it's moving all the time. It's a stream of thinking, of being conscious. So he moved away from what was in the laboratory and trying to measure things experimentally, and he tried then to look at research to focus on how people adapt and behave in the real world. So behavior is purposeful. So that's where he came in, and the work he did was basically the foundation, or the first work around what we'll see later as a perspective of behaviorism. So those were the two very early schools of thoughts. We're starting to look into the mind and breaking it down into components, but then saying, no, we need to now look at what is the function. What is the function of consciousness, and how does it contribute to our behavior? So that was back in the late 1800s. Those two schools of thought came into being. So a little of a history lesson, but two important founders of the discipline of psychology. So what happened after that is we come into different perspectives and different ways of looking at things. And there are 6 different perspectives that we look at in psychology, 6 fundamental perspectives that really shape the discipline, and each one is very different. Each one looks at a different part of psychology in a different way. And a theorist in psychology, our work is littered with theorists, and those are the people who come up with the theories based on principles and beliefs that they want to go and they investigate and they research and they give evidence for. So our very first sort of psychological perspective of the 20th century, so now we've moved into modern times, or relatively modern times of the 20th century, is around it's called the psychoanalytic or psychodynamic perspective, which features theorists who you probably may have even heard of. We have Freud and we have Jung, are the two that we consider. And they were very much interested in the unconscious motives. What is our unconscious? It's things that we're not necessarily aware of at this present time. It's things that are seated below our consciousness, and very much aware that the experiences that people have in their early childhood can give rise to mental disorders and govern personality. That is what the psychoanalytic, psychodynamic sort of perspective was. So Freud, Sigmund Freud, and we'll go back into Freud in later chapters. So this is really just giving you an overview of who Freud is and how he contributed to this particular perspective. And he used a process, and this is what he's responsible for in psychology. He used a process called psychoanalysis. psychoanalysis to treat people with psychological problems. So what he did was, he was very much, you see a picture of a person lying on a couch with a psychologist sitting next to them, trying to probe inside them by asking them questions to try and get beyond what is conscious into their unconscious, to try and determine what the root of their psychological disorder was. And back in the day, he studied, I think it was like hysteria. Women were thought to be hysterical over something. So he would say, well, the hysteria is a result of something that happened that you've suppressed. It sits within your unconscious. And he would use a process of psychoanalysis to try and break through that, to try and find out what this problem was. But as much as things are unconscious, he felt that he looked at analyzing dreams, because he felt that these unconscious thoughts came to be through people's dreams, through people's memories and desires that impact on behavior. So he looked very much at analyzing dreams of people. There's a thing called a Freudian slip, or a slip of the tongue, where you say something but you mean something else. And he says that things like the called Freudian slips are revealing things that are unconscious to us. So people very much are not masters or in control of their own minds. It's very much what has happened before that's been repressed. And that's what he tried to do. And so he had an emphasis on sex and sexual development, control of repressed sexual urges, and all of these things led to psychological disorders, and he tried to uncover. And he did a lot of his work through individual case studies, that he would examine people with various disorders and try and probe them. And you'll see there's some research on the work that he does around case studies, but he also examined himself. He introspected on himself. He even used cocaine or drugs to try and get beyond his conscious into his unconscious. So very much any disorder is a result of something that's buried deep below our conscious levels, but it slips sometimes into our consciousness in the form of dreams. So that's what his I've lost my word. His contribution was to the 20th century was psychoanalysis. And there were people, when he put his theory out there, people followed him for a while, but eventually they broke away and they decided, well, actually there's more to it than this, and I now believe that things happen differently. And one of those people is Carl Jung, who used to work with Sigmund Freud, but then gradually from that developed his own perspective, his own theory, his own set of assumptions that he put forward. So he was also part of that analytic approach, and he started to look more at personality developments, and he started to look that there are various different kinds of personalities. And as much as people have an unconscious sort of being, he looked very much that there was a collective unconscious, that he was quite spiritual and religious, and he felt that mental images and things like that were shared across humanity based on shared experiences and culture. And he developed things called archetypes, which are mental images. So remember, this is back in the early 1900s, and so things have changed progressively since then. So these are historical influences in psychology, and so those are the two theorists who added to this perspective, the psychoanalytical perspective of psychology. And so guys, do some more research on them. Some of your questions will ask you to maybe provide a little bit about this particular perspective, examples, and how they were researched. And a lot of the research done at this time, or certainly within Freud's case, was done through case studies, and that's how he drew his conclusions. The next major school of thought, which is still very relevant, and we go into this in a lot more detail in a later module, is around behaviorism, which can also be called learning. And this is very much on what we said, is that behaviorism now really looks at things that are observable. So prior to that, it wasn't really observable. We were trying to go into people's unconscious, whereas now the behaviorists came forward and they said, well, we need to actually study what is observable. So it's the behaviorist approach, and it's the paradigm in psychology called behaviorism. And they said that psychology should be seen as a science, and theories need to be supported by data through careful and controlled observation and measurement of behavior. That's specifically what they were looking at. So very much concerned with what you can see, how you see people act or behave compared to things internal like thinking and emotion. So observable behavior can be observed, objectively and scientifically measured. So very much the study of that outward observation of behavior. It's very much like a stimulus and response. It can be called stimulus and response psychology. So a stimulus is provided and a response is given to that stimulus. So what they do is they look at people's responses. So a stimulus is something that's observable in the environment that happens, and the response is the behavior that happens as a result of that stimulus. Very much based around rewards and punishment, things like modeling behavior, imitation, and whatever can be used for an individual to act in a certain way. So looking really at what behavior is, and very much based in the early days on using animals, because it's sort of, you can't really lock people in a laboratory and do experiments on them to watch what happens with their behavior. So a lot of the work around the founders of behaviorism was done using animals and psychology, and we'll touch on that shortly. So the founder of behaviorism was John B. Watson. He was called the founder, and he was looking for, it has to be observable. Okay, so whatever's measured has to be observable. And therefore consciousness and mental processes are not scientific, therefore do not fit into the discipline. So that was his steadfast sort of orientation, was it has to be observable. If it's not observable, it can't be measured, therefore it doesn't fit into the discipline. So very much a role of the behaviorist is to look at the nature and nurture debate. Are people born or are they made? And this was where he came to the fore, was entering into this discussion. Nature is a behavior that's determined by genetic influence. We behave the way we do because of our genes. But nurture tells us that it's not that. It tells us that it's very much our behavior, the way we act is very much based on the environment we live in and the experiences we have. So very much a nature-nurture debate. Are we born this way or are we made this way? And what we eventually see is that it's an intertwining of both. That happens, and we see that, we study that. A lot of our research is based on studies of twins who have the same genetic makeup but are reared apart. Maybe they've been adopted and reared apart, and then we go back in later and we look at how they behave, and we say, well, is it a nature or a nurture thing? And it's generally an intertwining of both. So Watson himself was a believer in nurture, very much believing in the environmental factors around us that caused us to behave the way we do. And he did an experiment, which we'll also cover later, is called Little Albert, where he conditioned children into being scared of all things white. So he started with I think it was a white rabbit, and he brought a little white rabbit into a room with a child, and at the same time he presented the rabbit that was white. He let off a really loud noise, so the child was scared. And basically, if you condition somebody enough, the child became scared of everything white. Even if it was Father Christmas's beard, the child was scared of it. So he demonstrated that a child could be conditioned to fear something, and that's really where the learning component of behavior comes in. It's about learning and how we can condition people through classical conditioning or operant conditioning, which we'll study later, or through observational learning to fear things, etc. And he actually ended up in advertising. And you can see that behaviorism is fundamental in advertising, that we all watch people on TV and an advert behave or do something in a certain way. Therefore, we're conditioned to want that or need that. So behaviorism really did form the foundation of advertising. And I think John B. Watson fitted in there quite well. Ivan Pavlov, I'm not sure if you've heard of Pavlov's dog, and we cover that later, but he basically looked at conditioning reflexes. He had a process called classical conditioning. So he looked at basically natural responses, so about salivation in dogs and how a food or a bone causes the dog to salivate. And then he would ring a bell and the dog didn't salivate, but the dog salivated to the bone. But when he put the bone and the bell together, And the dog then was conditioned to associate the bell with food. So when the bell rang after that, the dog would salivate. So it's about learning, it's about behavior, and it's about how you can condition a response in somebody. And we see that in our own lives about how we are conditioned to respond to certain things. And this is what behaviorists look at, is that you can change the way people act and behave. So when we talk about modifying behavior, which we spoke at in the beginning as one of the outcomes of psychology, it's about modify. And a lot of scientific work now, or psychological work, focuses around behavior modification. I hope you're all still with me and this isn't sounding long-winded. Skinner was another very famous behaviorist, and you'll study him later. And he looked at operant conditioning, and he had a little Skinner box that was called a Skinner box, and he put a rat in it. And he basically said that if something is rewarded, the behavior is repeated. So the rat was conditioned to push a button to release food. And once the rat had been conditioned to do that, it repeatedly then pushed the button to release food. So it was a positive response. It's about rewarding behavior. So if you reward something, the behavior will happen again. Okay. If there's and you can also reduce a negative response. So if something negative happens, so at one point I think they put an electrical shock inside the thing, and the rat could push the button and the electrical shock would stop. So it's not being rewarded, but it's turning something that's negative, it's reducing that negative experience. That's what operant conditioning is, and we'll cover it. But Skinner was a classical behaviorist that really did focus on learning and rewarding and punishing and reducing negative responses in behavior, using this design called a Skinner box. That was his measurement, or his scientific method, and he measured the response rate of the rat, and he came into learning and behaviorism. So that was our second perspective, was behaviorism. So we've got psychoanalytical and we've got behaviorism. And then after that, in the 1950s, came along humanism. Now humanism is really relevant, and it says basically humans are free, rational beings, and we have our potential. What we strive for is personal growth, and that we're very different from animals. So looking at the work of behaviorists working with animals, humanists are, no, you can't work with animals, you've got to work with humans, and every human has the ability to grow. That's their fundamental belief, is that we're all striving for that personal growth. So the humanists came along and they said, as humans, we've got unique qualities, okay? And they don't necessarily seek to explain why we're behaving in a certain way. They just focus on the potential for change and the freedom and that potential for personal growth and to fulfill our potential. So by fulfilling our potential, what they're saying is we get to a point where we can self-actualize, that we want to strive to be the best person that we can be, and that we all have that ability in us. We've just got to find it. Okay, and if we can't get there, if we can't get to our personal growth, or we can't self-actualize, then that's where we can't reach our potential, and that's why we have mental disturbances. So it's very much an approach that is based on listening to people, very client-centered. If you get a lot of people who still work in this way, that it's not about a subject, it's about a client. It's about an open conversation, communication, to break down barriers so that people can overcome obstacles to be able to reach their full potential. Very much based on listening, and that no societies are bad. There are just bad people sometimes in the society. So two important theorists that come into this humanist perspective, and you may have heard of Abraham Maslow, who's cited a lot, especially in organizational psychology and people's well-being, is that he basically said people's needs sit in this pyramid, of which we have to work our way from the bottom to the top. And we can't progress up the pyramid unless we've satisfied that need that's at the bottom. So it's a hierarchy of needs, and that's how we're motivated. We're motivated to move up this pyramid to reach a point of self-actualization, but we can't get there if we're not meeting our basic needs. So our first need is physiological need. It's air, food, water, shelter. And we can't start thinking about our safety and security unless we've got those basic needs satisfied. Once those are satisfied, we can then start to look at things like employment, our health, our prosperity. And once those are satisfied, we can then move on to satisfying our needs for love and belonging and intimacy. And once those are satisfied, we start to develop our self-esteem, our respect, our freedom, our strength. And once we've got that, we can get to a point where we can self-actualize and be the most that we can be. But we can't do that if we're missing the basic satisfaction of those physiological and safety needs, which does make sense. If you look at people in poverty, they're not going to get a point of self-esteem and self-actualization when they don't know how they're going to put food on the table. They don't have clean water, they don't have safety, they don't have shelter. So those needs being met are fundamental. And he studied people, and he studied sort of biographies of people who he believed had got to a point of self-actualization, those true people who had reached the pinnacle of understanding who they are. And he studied it through biographies of those people to see what made them into self-actualizing individuals. And Carl Rogers was another psychologist at this particular time. And again, you can see that he sees this conflict. He's also striving for self-actualization, but he says we have a sort of self-image, how we see ourselves now compared to our ideal self, where we want to be. So his theory basically says that we've got a self-concept which has three components: our self-worth, our self-image, and our ideal self. And he developed an approach of client-centered therapy to help people self-actualize or reach their full potential. So it's finding some congruence between how we see ourselves now and how we see ourselves in the future. What is our ideal self? And finding that overlap or that congruent part where we can develop our own sense of worth. So he's an important humanistic psychologist who sat within this period, who dealt with this idea of self-actualization and those human qualities that really allow us to reach our full potentials. So we can see very much how all these different perspectives are very different. And they still change as we go on, but each one has got some historical basis that's continued into our present day, and new theories take pieces of these, and often new theories are an interaction of these different perspectives. And then we have the evolutionary perspective. I just want to go back because I don't know, humanism, evolutionary. So evolutionary psychology is quite a new form of psychology, but basically you all understand what evolution is. It's based on how over time, through the process of natural selection, we have evolved. We evolve to survive, basically to survive and to reproduce. That's ultimately what evolution does. It shows how species have developed over time to change, to evolve, to survive, to reproduce. That's what the ultimate reason is. So evolutionary psychology basically says that the human brain itself comprises mechanisms or psychological adaptations that have evolved over time to support the process of natural selection. Okay, so favorable adaptations, the way we've evolved to support our survival, have passed down through generations. So, for example, an adaptation could be things as a tendency to be vigilant for potential threat. So back in the days in caveman times, people were cognizant of what could be a threat to them. It could be an animal, it could be something that you don't eat because it's poisonous, but over time our brains have evolved from this adaptation of survival and reproduction to our current state, where we are still very conscious of things that are potential threats. It's almost like it's an evolutionary capacity in us. It looks at things like mating preferences, how our goal of evolution is to reproduce. Therefore, we select partners who are similar to us. It's an evolutionary perspective. How we acquire language is also quite evolutionary. So the evolutionary psychology says basically how evolution has shaped the mind and behavior, and our behavior evolves to solve adaptive problems of natural selection and survival of the species. So that's a perspective that is also relevant and needs to be considered. Another perspective is cognitive psychology, and again we go into this a little bit more later on. And our cognitive psychology really looks at, it's those mental processes that we can't understand behavior unless we can understand how people get information, store and process information. So it's very much how people think. It's the relationship between the mind, the body, and behavior. And cognitive distortions lead to abnormal behavior. So any distortions in how we think about something can lead to abnormal behavior. So it's very much the study of those internal mental processes that we spoke about in our core definition. So when we look at cognitive psychology going forward, we look at things around intelligence. We look at things around perception, how we perceive the environment around us. We look at things like what we pay attention to in our environment. We look at memory. We look at how we think and how we solve problems, and we look at language. Those are our the mental processes, that part that ultimately leads to behavior, and any distortion in those particular mental processes leads to abnormal behavior. So if you can correct the mental processes, then ultimately you can modify the behavior. So that's what cognitive psychology does. Again, it's in the 20th century, it's more recent, and again, it's a field that is continually evolving and expanding. And the final perspective that we look at is that biological approach. So there is a biological basis to psychology, and we study that quite early on, is that our physical being, our brain, our nervous system, our central nervous system, the biochemical processes that take place in our body underlie our behavior. So it looks very much at, if you suffer from stress, you have certain stress hormones that are released into your body. Those stress hormones have an impact on your well-being. If you suffer from depression, for example, it can be a chemical imbalance in your brain that needs to be treated through a medical procedure or medical input or medication. So very much biology and neuroscience are intertwined with psychology. It looks at things like hormones, neurotransmitters, diseases, medication, things that are hereditary to us, part of genetics. So psychological issues are certainly impacted by biological processes. So we spend a module really looking at the biology of our behavior, our central nervous system, our brain, how different parts of the brain impact our behavior. So the physiological processes, we dig into the brain, the nervous system, some of the treatments involve medication, and as well as physical sensations. So that's a very clear approach to psychology, is that biological neuroscience perspective. So in your textbook, you'll see there's a table that really says to you, these are the 6 contemporary. So contemporary means they are sort of the more recent. So we're talking about the 20th century perspectives. That we have the behavioral psychology, we have psychoanalytic, we have the humanistic, the cognitive, the biological, and the evolutionary. So all of those basic perspectives and all of those basic premises are still relevant today. People have put their own sort of experiences into them, their own research into them, but often it is a combination. So to treat something from a biological perspective, there's also an impact on people's thoughts and mental cognition. So if you have depression, it might have a biological basis, but the outcome is something wrong in the way we think about something. So there's an intertwining of these different perspectives, and that's what we'll see moving forward. So for now, it's a case of understanding that there are these different perspectives, and they're very important within the discipline or within the framework of psychology and how it's developed. And moving on in psychology, obviously, as a discipline, and we've looked at how broad it can be. If you want to take psychology forward for any reason, there are different areas of psychology that you can specialize in. So you have clinical psychology who deals specifically with cognitive disorders, behavior disruptions, abnormal behaviors. You have people who are neuropsychologists, deal with the brain and the neurotransmitters and the impact that the brain has on behavior. People who get into counseling psychology, educational psychology, people who specialize in research psychologists, industrial psychologists who deal with organizational issues. Then even beyond that, there's subcategories. So you have people who are registered with as counselors. You have people who deal as doing personality tests or profiles. You have people who are mental health assistants. So all of those, it's a science, it's a discipline. And in South Africa, anybody within the discipline of psychology who moves beyond their sort of honors master's level into these disciplines needs to be registered with the Health Professions Council. So it's just showing you that psychology is a discipline, exactly like being a doctor is a discipline. If you pursue psychology further, you end up in a specific discipline, of which there's a number of areas of specialization. And you can see then that all these different theorists, all of these different schools, you can sort of see through your own research whose sort of theorists or schools you take pieces from. And when you look at a problem, you can frame it into one of those perspectives and you can approach it from that particular perspective. But again, that will evolve as you start to understand the discipline more. And psychologists are employed across a diverse array of industries. Psychologists are employed in schools, educational psychologists. Psychologists are employed in business and government. Psychologists are employed in hospitals and clinics. They're employed in colleges and universities, and they're in private practice. So it's very broad. And so this spectrum will evolve and become more. You'll see more of it as we progress, and there might be areas of it that you say, well, this is an area that really interests me. Maybe I might like to specialize in this kind of psychology or educational psychology or whatever it might be. So just to understand that it's a very broad discipline. And the final part that we just cover is, and again, you'll see it in the textbook, and the textbook does refer to it. This textbook specifically has South African connotations. That psychology is a discipline, and you can see from its evolutionary history, especially in the 19th and the 20th centuries, it's very much Western. It's very much based around white, middle-class males. They are the primary theorists, and that's where a lot of the psychology has evolved from. So more and more, it's now saying, how does psychology interact in an African context and even in a South African context? So although psychology benefits all, its fundamental underpinnings come from that Western-based discipline and a typical demographic, white, middle-aged male from higher income backgrounds. So modern psychology is developing in South Africa. It developed from about 1910 onwards, but very much a colonial influence. Therefore, what happened in South Africa around psychology and development sort of followed that same pattern. But there is now a movement towards an African psychology, an Afrocentric psychology that brings in more cultural variables. It's really important when we look at psychology, especially in the places that we are, the cultural responsiveness that we have, our socioeconomic, how different we all are, that we take on board those cultural and social values. So you'll see throughout the book, it's applied South African context. When necessary, it talks about cultural variables that come into practice. Things around in Afrocentric psychology or African psychology, a lot of our African psychology can be based around the spirituality, the culture, ancestors, and the impact they have on psychological well-being. What happens outside the natural self in the spiritual realm is very important to understand. So as much as we're learning psychology from a discipline that comes from a sort of that Western background, we're going to have to start to understand it more from an African perspective. And an African psychology. So we're trying to address that imbalance. So a lot of our new reading, and I would encourage you to try and, when you do research, because research is fundamental, you try and find research that is African based. It's research that's been done in South Africa that takes into account those unique variables that happen in an African context when looking at various research and theories. So that's the psychology in Africa. So guys, that's sort of the end of our collab. You've all been deathly quiet. As it says, I don't know what you're thinking. I can only see how you're acting. So I'm studying psychology, not telepathy. So I hope this is it's just an overview take time on that first chapter. I think it points you specifically to this 20th century era and these people who I've mentioned as theorists in these new perspectives of the 20th century. That's where I think one of your activities is in your learning unit. So understand you do need to do some extra research on those different perspectives when it comes to doing assignments. Don't just take what's in the textbook. Do some research on your understanding of what psychology is. Make sure you've got clear ideas of what the mind, mental process, and behaviors are, and then you can explain things in your own words, which is fundamental. So are there any questions, or are you all rushing off to enjoy your public holiday tomorrow? I'm here if you've got any questions. I will upload the recording for you tomorrow. I will upload the slides for you to use as notes or to check through. If you've got any questions, you're welcome to send me an email. We've got another Collab in 2 weeks' time where we'll do the second learning unit, and then we would have all the information we need for the first assignment. So if you've covered this learning unit, try to do the ICE task, and I'll give you feedback. I'll have a look over the next day or two to see if there's any in. Otherwise, start working through the material of the second learning unit. Are you all good? Because you're awfully quiet. Thumbs up is good. Okay. All right, guys. Well, I wish you all a good Women's Day tomorrow. Take some time and have some time to yourself. Don't panic about psychology. And if you've got any questions, as I said, email me. So I'm going to stop the recording now.